Noah Miller's world shattered on a humid Long Beach night when his father Ed hurled his suitcase out the front door with a roar that shook the walls. "You're no son of mine, get out!" At 20, Noah stood frozen on the porch, heart pounding as the screen door slammed shut, his confession of being gay igniting a fire that burned his family ties to ash. 30 seconds earlier, he'd stuttered the truth over dinner, eyes locked on the table, only to see Ed's fist slam down and Sara, his older sister, sneer, "You're disgusting." 5 years of hiding who he loved ended with Ed's boots stomping and Linda, his mother, sobbing, "Fix yourself, please." Her pleas drowned by the crash of his life hitting the pavement. One moment, one word, and the Millers cast him out like driftwood into the California tide. He stumbled down the steps with the suitcase splitting at the seams, spilling shirts and dreams onto the cracked sidewalk under a sky heavy with salt and stars. Ed loomed in the doorway with arms crossed, a fisherman turned tyrant whose seafood shop fed half the harbor, his face red from years of sun and now rage. Linda clutched her apron with trembling hands, whispering prayers Noah couldn't hear, her faith no match for the storm Ed unleashed. Sara, 23 and sharp as a reef, stood beside them with a glare that cut deeper than words, her silence louder than the gulls crying overhead. Neighbors peeked through blinds along the sleepy street, shadows witnessing a boy erased from his own blood. 5 years of shared meals and surf trips sinking beneath their judgment. Noah dragged the suitcase half a block, with his breath hitching, the ocean breeze tugging at his hair as he turned from the house he'd known since birth. Long Beach sprawled before him with its neon-lit piers and rumbling docks, a city he'd roamed with Sara on summer nights, chasing waves and stealing fries. Ed had taught him to bait a hook at 6, Linda baked his birthday cakes with too much frosting, and Sara once patched his knee when he fell off his bike. Now those hands pushed him away, those voices condemned him, and that bike sat locked in a garage he'd never enter again. He'd come out to keep living true, but truth left him homeless with $50 in his pocket and a phone buzzing with Sara's last text, "Don't come back." He slept that night on a bench by the pier with the suitcase as a pillow, the crash of waves mocking his fall, his body shivering under a thin jacket as the fog rolled in. Days bled into weeks, with Noah scraping by, washing dishes at a diner until the grease stained his soul, then crashing in a shelter where the air smelled of despair. 5 months later, he found a lifeline in a delivery app with its promise of cash for pedaling. A beat-up bike, his ticket to survival. He rode through Long Beach with orders stacked high, pizza boxes and burger bags strapped to his back, the streets a blur of memory and hunger. Rain soaked him, sun scorched him, but he pedaled on, 20 now, 25, a ghost in a city that forgot him, his family a wound he couldn't stitch. The job carved a rhythm from chaos with Noah weaving through traffic, tires humming on asphalt, each delivery $1 closer to rent for a cramped room above a laundromat. He'd pass the old house sometimes with his heart lurching, its blue paint peeling like his past, lights glowing behind curtains he once hung. Ed's truck sat in the drive, Linda's garden wilted, and Sara's window stayed dark. 5 years stretching the silence into a chasm. He'd pedal faster then, pizza steaming in his bag, the ache of rejection fueling every turn, a delivery guy with no home to claim but the road. 5 years of sweat and solitude hardened him, but the boy who loved men and lost everything lingered, pedaling through a life he'd built from scraps. That bike carried him forward with its chain rattling like his thoughts, a lifeline he didn't know would circle back to the house that spat him out. This is where it starts, a tale of a boy thrown out for being himself, clawing through a world that didn't care. If this hooks you deep, smash that like, share it with someone who's been kicked aside, and subscribe to Heartstories. We're here for the raw cuts of life, and I need you with me for this ride. Noah pedaled through Long Beach with rain streaking his face, the tires of his battered bike humming against wet asphalt as a late October storm churned the Pacific into a gray roar. 5 years had hardened him into a 25-year-old delivery guy, his life a rhythm of orders and tips stitched together by the grind of a gig app glowing on his cracked phone screen. That night, the app pinged with a new job, a pizza run from Tony's on Ocean Boulevard, and he swiped accept without a thought, rain dripping from his hood as he slung the thermal bag over his shoulder. Then the address flashed up, 1427 Pine Street, and his breath caught sharp in his throat, the bike wobbling as he braked hard on a slick corner. That was home, the blue house with the sagging porch where Ed had thrown him out, where Linda had sobbed, where Sara had sneered. 5 years of exile slamming back into his chest like a rogue wave. He stared at the screen with water pooling in his sneakers, the app's timer ticking down as his mind raced through a fog of memory and dread. 5 years peddling these streets, dodging cars and chasing dollars. He'd passed that house a dozen times with his eyes averted, its shadow a bruise he couldn't touch. Now it called him back with a $12 order, 2 pepperonis and a Coke, a mundane pull to a place that had spat him out when he was 20. Noah's fingers hovered over cancel, his pulse hammering, rain drumming on the bag as he pictured Ed's truck in the drive, Linda's voice behind the door, Sarah's cold stare. He could ditch it, take the hit to his rating, pedal off into the storm, but something tugged harder, a thread of curiosity or defiance, and he kicked off with his jaw clenched, the bike slicing through puddles toward a past he couldn't outrun. The streets blurred by, with neon signs flickering in the downpour. Long Beach a maze of wet concrete and salt air, as Noah rode with the pizza steaming against his back. Pine Street loomed closer with each turn, its bungalows hunched under dripping palms, the old neighborhood a ghost town of his childhood. He remembered racing Sara down this block on scooters, her laugh echoing as they dodged sprinklers, Ed grilling fish in the yard while Linda hung laundry. 5 years gone, and he was a stranger now, a delivery guy in a soaked jacket, not the boy who'd carved his name into the porch rail. The house came into view with its chipped blue paint glinting under a street lamp. Ed's truck gone, Linda's garden a tangle of weeds, the windows dim but for a faint glow upstairs. Noah's stomach knotted as he rolled to a stop, the rain a curtain between him and the door, 5 years of silence about to break. He climbed off the bike with legs trembling, propping it against a rusted mailbox as water streamed from his hood and the pizza bag sagged in his grip. The porch steps creaked under his sneakers, the same ones he'd stumbled down with his suitcase splitting, Ed's roar still echoing in his skull. He raised a fist to knock with his breath, shallow, the door's faded wood a wall between then and now, and waited as the storm howled around him. Footsteps shuffled inside with a slow drag, a shadow flickering behind the peephole, and the door cracked open to reveal Sara, 28 and hollowed out, her eyes sunken above dark rings, hair a mess of tangles framing a face he barely knew. She blinked at him with no spark of recognition, her voice a rasp. "Pizza's late," as she fumbled for cash with hands that shook. A bottle of wine tipped over on the table behind her. Noah stood rooted with the rain pounding his back, the thermal bag clutched tight as he scanned her over the threshold. 5 years stretching between them like a canyon. Sara looked nothing like the sister who'd sneered at him, her sharp edges dulled by something heavier than time, her sweater hanging loose on a frame too thin. The living room sprawled behind her with clutter choking the space, pizza boxes stacked on the couch, a lumpy blanket spilling to the floor, and a bottle of pills glinting on the counter beside an empty glass. Her gaze drifted past him with a vacancy that prickled his neck, her fingers dropping the cash as she muttered, "Keep the change," and turned away, leaving the door ajar. Noah's gut twisted with a warning he couldn't name, her stumble, her slur, the pills, a puzzle snapping into place too fast to ignore. He stepped forward with the pizza still in hand, rain dripping onto the welcome mat as Sara shuffled toward the kitchen, her back to him, a ghost in a house he'd once called his. 5 years ago, she'd stood with Ed and Linda, her silence a blade in his chest. But now she moved like she'd lost more than a brother. Her shoulders slumped under a weight he didn't understand. Noah set the bag on the table with his eyes darting to the pills, the label blurred but the count low, too low for a bottle that size. She reached for a glass with a tremble, her mutter, "Thanks," barely audible over the storm, and something in her sway, her stillness, screamed wrong. He lingered with his hood shadowing his face, 5 years of hurt warring with a flicker of instinct, a delivery guy on the edge of a past he couldn't shake. Noah lingered in the doorway of the old Long Beach house with rain hammering the porch roof, his soaked sneakers leaving puddles on the mat as Sara shuffled away from him into the shadowed kitchen. 5 years had carved a stranger from the sister he'd known. Her once sharp frame now brittle, her steps unsteady as she reached for a glass with hands that shook like leaves in the storm. He'd delivered the pizza with his hood shadowing his face, but something held him there. A prickle of unease crawling up his spine as he watched her sway against the counter. The living room sprawled behind her with chaos spilling across it. Empty wine bottles glinting in the dim light, pizza boxes stacked like tombstones. And that bottle of pills on the counter, catching his eye again. Its cap loose, its contents scattered. She muttered something low, "Good night," her voice a slur. And Noah's gut twisted hard. 5 years of distance, no match for the instinct screaming that this wasn't right. He stepped inside with the thermal bag still clutched in his fist, rain dripping onto the warped floorboards as Sara fumbled with the glass, her fingers slipping. The clink of it hitting the sink echoing in the stillness. Noah's eyes darted to the pills with his heart thudding. The label smudged but the word Xanax legible. Half the bottle gone. Too much for one night. Too much for anyone. She turned with a stumble, her gaze unfocused, drifting past him to the wall where a faded photo of them hung crooked, two kids on a pier with ice cream melting down their hands. 5 years ago, she'd sneered as Ed threw him out, her silence cutting deeper than Linda's pleas. But now she looked broken, a shell of that girl, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Should have ordered sooner," and sank against the counter with her head dipping low. Noah dropped the bag with a thud, his hood slipping back as he crept closer, the storm's roar fading behind the pulse in his ears. He'd pedaled away from this house at 20, with Ed's curses ringing, built a life from scraps as a delivery guy. But here he stood at 25, drawn back by a sister he didn't recognize. Sara reached for the pills with a slow, deliberate motion, her fingers brushing the bottle, tipping it over as a handful spilled across the counter like pebbles on a grave. She scooped them up with a chin, her eyes glassy, and Noah froze with a memory flashing. Her voice from years ago, "Pizza's my last meal if I ever go." A joke from a summer night now turning real. He lunged forward with a shout, "Sara, no!" Grabbing her wrist as the pills clattered to the floor, her body slumping against him, with a sob wrenching from her throat. She fought him with weak fists pounding his chest, her cries a garbled mess. "Let me, I can't anymore." As Noah pinned her arms, his voice cracking. "You don't get to quit." 5 years of hurt boiled up with tears stinging his eyes, but he held her tight, her weight sagging as the fight drained out of her. He kicked the pills away with his foot, scattering them under the fridge, and eased her to the floor with his back against the cabinets, her head lolling on his shoulder. Sara's breaths came shallow with her words slurring. Divorce, job, gone. All gone. A confession spilling from a life unraveled, not about him, not about that night, but a collapse he'd stumbled into. Noah rocked her with his own breath, hitching. The kitchen a battlefield of their past, 5 years apart crashing into this moment of raw, desperate need. He fumbled for his phone with one hand, dialing 911 as Sara's sobs faded to whimpers, her body limp against him, the operator's voice cutting through. "Emergency, what's your location?" Noah stammered the address, 1427 Pine Street, with his voice shaking. "She took pills, she's fading. Hurry!" He dropped the phone with the call live, his arms tightening around her as he whispered, "Stay with me, Sara." Rain pounding the windows like a drum roll to her pulse. She'd wanted pizza, her favorite, a last meal before the end, and he'd brought it. A delivery guy turned lifeline, 5 years of exile undone by a chance order. Sirens wailed in the distance with their red wine slicing the night. Help coming? But Noah stayed, his hoodie soaked. His sister's weight a tether to a family he'd lost, now found in the wreckage. Sara's eyes fluttered with a flicker of focus, her hand clutching his sleeve as she rasped, "Noah?" Recognition breaking through the haze, a name she hadn't spoken in half a decade. He nodded with tears spilling. "Yeah, it's me." His voice a lifeline pulling her back, 5 years of silence shattering as she clung to him, a sister he had saved from a darkness he couldn't name. The ambulance screeched up with lights flashing through the curtains, boots pounding the porch, but Noah held her still, his heart a drum against her cheek, the past a ghost in the room with them. She'd fallen apart from divorce and a job lost. Not him, not their fight, But he'd caught her anyway, a delivery turned deliverance, a bond he didn't know still lived. Paramedics burst in with bags clattering, pulling Sara from his arms as Noah staggered back, his hoodie dripping, his chest heaving with the weight of what he'd done. They worked fast with voices sharp, pulse weak, overdose. As they strapped her to a gurney, her eyes locked on him until the door slammed shut. Noah sank to the floor with his hands shaking, pizza box cold on the table, the house empty again. 5 years of running stopped by a night he couldn't flee. Sirens faded with Sara's life hanging on, and he stayed, a brother who'd lost everything, now giving it back, the past a thread he'd pulled without knowing where it led. Noah slumped against the kitchen cabinets in the old Long Beach house with his hoodie soaked and his hands trembling. The echo of ambulance sirens fading into the rain as paramedics wheeled Sara away. 5 years had vanished in a heartbeat when he'd pulled her back from the edge. A delivery guy turned savior in a home that had spat him out at 20. He'd called 911 with her limp in his arms, pizza cold on the table, her final wish before a bottle of pills nearly took her under. Not for him, but for a life broken by divorce and a job lost. Now the house stood silent, with its walls pressing in. The storm outside a dull roar as he waited, unsure why he stayed, his breath fogging in the dim light until headlights cut through the curtains, tires crunching gravel, and the front door burst open with Ed's bellow filling the space. What the hell happened? Ed stormed in with Linda trailing behind, her face pale and streaked with tears, both summoned by the hospital's call about Sara's overdose, their footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards Noah once knew by heart. At 25, he rose with his hood slipping back, rain dripping from his sleeves as Ed's eyes narrowed. You? Why are you here? Linda gasped with a hand flying to her mouth. Noah? Her voice a whisper breaking over 5 years of silence. Ed clenched his fists with his fisherman's bulk filling the doorway. Get out! You don't belong! But before Noah could move, Sara's voice rasped from the hall, faint but fierce. Stop! He saved me! She'd fought the medics to stay, staggering back with a blanket draped over her shoulders, her eyes locked on Noah, a lifeline she wouldn't let go. Linda rushed to Sara with a sob wrenching free. Baby, what did you do? Cradling her daughter's face as Ed loomed with his jaw tight, confusion warring with rage. Noah steeped back with his heart pounding. She took pills. I got here in time. His voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. 5 years of exile facing the family that had thrown him out. Sara pushed Linda's hands away with a shudder, her gaze cutting to Ed. He brought pizza, stayed, saw me fall apart. Then she broke with tears spilling, her confession slicing the air. I couldn't lose him again. Not after I found him. Ed froze with his fists, unclenching. Linda's sob catching, and Noah's breath hitched as Sara's words unraveled a past he'd never known. She sank to the couch with her voice cracking. 2 years ago, I tracked him down, Dad, after you burned his stuff. Noah's eyes widened with a memory stirring. A night in the rain when he'd been jumped for a late delivery, beaten bloody in an alley near the pier, waking in a clinic with his bills paid, and a new bike beside him. Sara's tears fell faster. I saw him there, broken, because of us. I paid the doctor, got him that bike. I couldn't tell you. Linda crumpled with a wail. You did what? As Ed's face drained, his growl faltering. You went behind us? Sara nodded with her voice raw. I hounded shelters, asked around, found him half dead. I couldn't let him go again. Not after we threw him out. Noah staggered with the weight of it. 5 years of pedaling on a bike she'd given, a sister's secret keeping him alive. Ed roared with his fists slamming the wall. You hid this? After we said he's done? But his voice cracked, the fury crumbling as Sara stood with her blanket slipping. I lost him once, it killed me. Then divorce, the job. I lost everything? He's all I had left. Linda clutched Sara with tears soaking her shirt. Why didn't you say? Her plea a knife in the silence, 5 years of guilt spilling out. Noah's throat tightened with his eyes burning. You found me? That bike? Sara met his gaze with a nod. I couldn't face you, not after what I did, but I couldn't let you die. Ed sank to a chair with his head in his hands. The man who'd thrown Noah out, now a shadow, Linda's sobs, a hymn to a family fractured by their own hands. The twist cut deep with Sarah's secret piercing the ears. A sister who'd sneered at 23, hounded by regret at 26, saving Noah when he'd hit bottom, only to break herself in silence. Noah stood with his hoodie dripping, 5 years of rage melting into something softer. You kept me going, and I didn't know. Ed lifted his eyes with a tremble. We didn't know. His voice a husk, Linda clinging to Sara as if she'd slip away again. Sarah's overdose, her pizza, her fall, all threads to a past where she'd fought for him, a fight she'd lost to divorce and despair, now pulling them back to a truth they couldn't dodge. 5 years apart, and Noah's rescue mirrored hers, a circle of pain and grace, a family facing what they'd sown. Noah stood in the wreckage of the Long Beach kitchen with rain drumming the windows, his soaked hoodie clinging to his shoulders as Sarah's confession hung heavy in the air, a thread of grace stitching through 5 years of exile. Ed slumped in a chair with his fisherman's hands cradling his face. Linda knelt beside Sara on the couch with tears carving paths down her cheeks, and the house held its breath. A battlefield turned confessional after Noah's rescue pulled them back from the brink. At 25, he'd pedaled into this night with a pizza, saved his sister from her own darkness, and uncovered her secret, a lifeline she'd thrown him 2 years ago when he lay broken in an alley, a bike and a hospital bill paid in silence. Now the family faced him with eyes that couldn't look away, 5 years of pain cracking open like the storm outside. Sara reached for Noah with a trembling hand, her voice a whisper through the haze of pills and grief. I never stopped missing you. He took it with his own shaking, sinking beside her as Linda's sob broke louder. We didn't know, we didn't see. Ed lifted his head with a grunt, his eyes red. I thought cutting you out fixed it, kept us whole. His words stumbling. Not an apology, but a fracture in the wall he had built. Noah's throat tightened with a reply lodging there. 5 years of pedaling through Long Beach, surviving on scraps, fueled by a bike Sara had given, now binding them in a moment neither saw coming. He squeezed her hand with a nod. You kept me alive. I kept you here. A pact forged in the ashes of their past. Linda rose with her apron twisted in her fists. Stay, Noah. Eat with us. Her plea raw, a mother's voice clawing back what she'd lost. But Ed's silence hung heavy, his jaw twitching with pride too stubborn to bend. Noah shook his head with a quiet strength. Not yet. Not like that. His gaze steady. 5 years of hurt too deep for one night to heal. Sara clutched his sleeve with a desperate grip. Don't go. Not again. Her eyes pleading through the fog of her overdose, a sister reborn from the edge. He softened with a promise. I'll come back for you. His voice a lifeline, not to the house, not to Ed's table, but to her, the one who'd sought him when no one else would. Days turned to weeks with Noah pedaling back to Pine Street, not as a delivery guy, but as a brother, bringing coffee and takeout to Sara's doorstep, sitting with her on the porch where Ed once threw him out. She'd shuffle out with a blanket wrapped tight, her steps stronger, her voice clearer, the pills gone, replaced by talks of divorce and a job lost, a life she'd unraveled alone. He listened with his bike propped nearby, 5 years of distance shrinking as she smiled. Faint but real, a spark he hadn't seen since they were kids. Linda hovered sometimes with nervous hands offering tea. Ed lingered in the yard with gruff nods. Their words few, their guilt a shadow. A family not whole but reaching. Redemption a slow burn through the cracks. Noah pooled his delivery tips with a dream-taking route, a tiny coffee cart he parked by the pier, its awning painted blue like the house he'd lost, a sign reading Sara's brew in her honor. She joined him with shaky hands steaming milk, her first job since the fall, a lifeline he'd thrown back. 5 years of exile turning to purpose. Ed drove by once with his truck idling, Linda beside him, their eyes on the cart, no words, just a look that lingered, a crack in the ice. Noah stayed at his rented room with Sara's number in his phone. Dinners at Pine Street rare but growing, a family not fixed, not forgiven, but tethered by a bond he'd pedaled to reclaim. He stood at the cart with the ocean stretching wide, Sara beside him, Two outcasts who'd saved each other. 5 years of pain, a scar they'd wear, not erase. Ed's pride, Linda's tears, their past a weight. But Noah and Sara held a thread of hope. A reunion raw and real. Redemption not in words, but in coffee poured and hands clasped. Who's pulled you back from the edge when you couldn't stand? Tell me their name below. If this broke your heart and stitched it up, please hit that like, share it with someone who's fought to stay, and subscribe to Heart Stories. I'm begging you, stick with us for these tales of survival. They're nothing without you.